Over London the air trembles. The year is 1940. The city lies in darkness, every window blacked out, every street emptied of life. Far above, faint red sparks trace across the night sky, not stars, but the glow of German incendiaries falling through the clouds. And then it starts again, the hum, the metallic thunder of engines, the sound that every Londoner now recognizes in their sleep, the Luftwaffe. Inside one of those bombers the air smells of oil, sweat and cold steel. A young German pilot peers into the void, where only darkness answers back. His instruments flicker weakly. Beneath him, a continent of lights once called Europe sleeps, and he, a son of the Reich, believes he owns the night. But tonight something is different. Something unseen is watching him. He feels it before he understands it, a presence like eyes staring from the dark. His gunner whispers through the intercom, "Was this das? What's that light behind us?" But before he can turn, the blackness explodes. A burst of cannon fire rips through the fuselage. One engine dies. The bomber rolls, spirals downward into a storm of flame and silence. No enemy in sight. No warning. Only the whisper of something unseen. Below, in the misted skies above southern England, another aircraft banks away. A twin-engine Bristol Beaufighter, its dark fuselage gliding through the fog like a ghost. Inside, two men breathe heavily, a pilot and his radar operator. Between them glows a small, circular screen, the faint trace of a blip now fading into nothing. Their faces are lit only by the pale light of that strange device, the Airborne Interception Radar, or AI. They don't cheer. They don't speak. They just keep searching the darkness. Because this war has only begun. It's hard to imagine now, but just 4 years earlier, none of this existed. No radar, no night fighting, no unseen hunters in the clouds. In 1936, Britain stood blind, proud but vulnerable, while across the Channel a storm was forming. Adolf Hitler had already broken the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was rearming fast. The Luftwaffe, his new air force, grew stronger by the month. And deep inside the British Air Ministry, a handful of scientists were staring at a question no general could answer. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see coming? They called it the range problem. If a bomber could strike before defenders even spotted it, no number of fighters could save the cities below. Britain's coastline was long, exposed, impossible to guard. The nation needed something new, a warning before the attack. Something invisible, faster than sound, faster than sight. That's when a quiet man named Robert Watson Watt entered the story. A Scottish physicist, thin, serious, with eyes that always seemed to be a few seconds ahead of everyone else. Watson Watt had been studying radio waves, how they could bounce, reflect, scatter through the air. It was theory, nothing more, until war made theory into necessity. In February 1935, in a cold field near Daventry, his team pointed a radio transmitter toward the sky, and a bomber flew through the beam. On a crude oscilloscope screen the signal wavered, a heartbeat of static that shouldn't have been there. The airplane had reflected the wave back. For the first time in human history, an aircraft had been detected by radio. The men in that van didn't cheer either. They simply knew what it meant. They had just given Britain a new sense, a way to see without seeing. Over the next year, a secret network began to rise along the British coast, a string of tall steel towers stretching from Scotland to the Isle of Wight. They called it Chain Home. Each tower pulsed invisible energy into the sky, watching for echoes. By 1939, this ghostly wall could detect aircraft more than 100 miles away. It wasn't perfect, the images were rough, the signals crude, but it was enough. Enough to buy time. Enough to fight back. But there was one problem no one could solve. Radar could see the bombers. It couldn't stop them. When the war came in September 1939, the system worked, sort of. British controllers could track incoming raids, direct fighters toward them. But once the sun went down, everything changed. The radar towers could still see the enemy, yet the pilots, up in the dark, were blind. Night fighting was chaos. The moment a pilot took off, he was alone in blackness, chasing ghosts. Early attempts looked almost desperate. Searchlights swept across the skies like frantic fingers. Anti-aircraft guns fired at shadows. Entire cities hid under blankets of darkness. And the Luftwaffe, seeing this, struck harder. They called it the Blitz. From September 1940 onward, London burned almost every night. Coventry, Birmingham, Bristol, each city became a target, each skyline a crucifix of smoke. More than 40,000 civilians would die in those raids. Yet even then the British refused to give up. Somewhere, hidden in a cold laboratory, the scientists were still working, searching for a way to bring the eye of radar into the sky. It sounded impossible. The radar sets on the coast were massive. Some weighed over a ton, powered by generators the size of cars. How could you fit that into a plane? How could you make a pilot see the invisible? But desperation is the mother of invention. At the telecommunications research establishment, a name deliberately boring so spies would ignore it, engineers began tearing apart their equipment, trimming every ounce, every inch. They built smaller magnetrons, lighter receivers, tighter circuits. They called the new device the AIMK-4. Airborne Interception Radar. A machine so crude it barely worked, and so revolutionary it changed the war. In the winter of 1939, the first test flights began. The chosen aircraft, the Bristol Blenheim, a light bomber with enough room in its nose to carry the bulky electronics. The crew had to sit shoulder to shoulder with racks of vacuum tubes and cables that hissed with static. The radar's range? Maybe 3 miles, if the weather was good. The operator watched a small screen with 2 lines that flickered like candlelight. When a target approached, a faint spike appeared. It was like chasing shadows in the fog. Yet even this was progress. For the first time, a British pilot could see an enemy at night, not with his eyes but through the echoes of invisible waves. Still, the system was fragile. The radar's beam was narrow, its accuracy poor. The Blenheim was too slow to catch a bomber even when it found one. The pilots complained, the scientists adjusted. But the war was not waiting. Every night, London bled. So they needed something faster, stronger. A new kind of hunter for a new kind of war. Enter the Bristol Beaufighter, twin engines, heavy armor, 420mm cannons mounted in the nose. Born from desperation, it was a brute of a machine, fast enough to chase, tough enough to survive. It could fight in darkness, guided not by sight but by sound and signal. It would become the first true night fighter. By 1940, squadrons of Beaufighters began to form under RAF Fighter Command. Their crews were a new breed, half pilot, half technician, men who trusted glowing screens more than their own eyes. Among them were veterans of the Battle of Britain, who had fought under the sun and now faced the darkness. They called themselves Night Hawks. They flew without lights, without formation. Only the whisper of radio and the pulse of radar kept them alive. Imagine that moment. A pilot climbing through cloud, eyes straining against blackness. Beside him, his operator murmuring, "Contact, 10 miles, bearing 270. He turns. The blip grows stronger. He can't see the enemy but he knows it's there. At 5 miles the echo sharpens. At 1 mile he can almost feel the enemy's prop wash. Then, suddenly, a shadow forms ahead, faintly silver against the starlight. He fires. A burst of cannon shells cuts through the night. The bomber disappears in flame. Below, Londoners look up as another burning shape falls through the clouds, unaware that for the first time the defenders of Britain have struck back in darkness. And somewhere, on the ground in occupied France, a Luftwaffe pilot listens to the news, hears the rumors spreading among his comrades. They say the British have a new weapon. They say the night is no longer safe. Some refuse to believe it. Others whisper of invisible beams, of ghostly fighters that appear from nowhere. They call them Nachtgeister, night ghosts. Soon the stories grow. Crews start to panic mid-flight, firing at shadows, aborting missions. Because how do you fight what you cannot see? By late 1940, the statistics begin to change. For every 100 bombers sent against Britain, more are not returning. And yet, the radar operators themselves remain unseen, their work hidden even from the pilots they protect. In public, the term radar doesn't exist. Official documents refer to it only as RDF, range and direction finding. The real truth is locked behind secrecy even within the Royal Air Force. The men who fly these missions don't fully understand how their own machines work. They just know it does. And that's enough. In every story of war, there's a moment when fear changes sides. For the first year of the Blitz, it was London that feared the dark. By 1941 it was the Luftwaffe. But innovation always comes with a cost. Each night, Beaufighter crews go up knowing most will never come back. Flying blind over blacked-out landscapes in turbulent air, One wrong turn and they vanish. Sometimes the radar malfunctions. Sometimes their target explodes too close. The sky swallows them without a trace. Still, they climb again the next night, guided only by that flickering light on the scope, their invisible eye. Because somewhere up there, another bomber is coming. And as the echoes dance across the screen, the war of invisibility begins. The night skies over Europe changed slowly, almost imperceptibly, until fear made it real. By 1941, German bomber crews began to notice something strange. Flights that once returned with ease were vanishing, one by one. Entire squadrons went silent, not shot down by flak or searchlights, but disappearing into the black. At first they blamed navigation errors. Then fatigue. Then fate. But as the months passed, the stories became harder to ignore. Survivors spoke of being stalked, hunted, by unseen fighters that struck without warning, without light, without mercy. On the ground, Luftwaffe officers dismissed these claims. There are no British planes at night, they said. Impossible. But the pilots knew better. They had seen the shadows move. Some called them the Black Death. Others whispered, Der unsichtbare Feind, the invisible enemy. And in London, the British Air Ministry quietly smiled. The Beaufighter was proving its worth. Its radar, the AIMK, though primitive, was saving the nation. Each success was paid for in blood, but the data it provided pushed the technology forward faster than anyone imagined possible. Every returning crew reported what they'd seen, heard, and sensed. Scientists at TRE worked through the night, adjusting circuits, recalibrating screens, trimming weight by ounces, adding sensitivity by fractions. And with every improvement, the hunters grew sharper. Imagine the radar operator's world. He sits behind the pilot, face lit by a single cathode screen. Two glowing lines, one vertical, one horizontal, intersect in the center. Each pulse of energy sweeps through the night, searching for a reflection. When a plane enters the cone, a faint blip rises on the display. It's crude, ghostly, but it's life or death. A bump of static could be an echo. An echo could be a bomber. A bomber could mean victory, or a coffin. They call the device AI, airborne interception. But to the men who trust it, it's simply the eye. It took skill to read it. Patience. Instinct. The operator's voice became the pilot's second sight. Range 2 miles. Closing fast. Turn left 5 degrees. Contact visual, engage. Moments later, cannon fire split the dark, and another enemy burned out of the sky. By the spring of 1941, the Beaufighter squadrons had turned defense into offense. They were now hunting the hunters. And every German pilot knew it. High above the English Channel, a Heinkel He-111 droned toward London. Inside, the crew was tense, the air filled with the smell of sweat and kerosene. The radio crackled, ground control giving course corrections, altitude warnings. Then the static rose again, and a voice broke through, unknown contact, starboard rear. But there was nothing to see. Just darkness. Then a flash, brief, silent. The rear gunner spun his turret, empty sky. Seconds later, cannon shells ripped through the fuselage. Fire engulfed the wing. The bomber tumbled into oblivion. On the ground, radar stations picked up a faint signal, tracking 2 blips. One fading, one turning home. Another victory. Another secret buried in the night. Yet for all their triumphs, the British night fighters faced their own terror. The technology they trusted could turn against them. The AIMK-4 radar was powerful but temperamental. It drew so much energy that it sometimes disrupted the aircraft's own instruments. Magnetic compasses spun wildly, radios crackled with interference. A pilot might chase a signal only to realize, too late, that he was following his own reflection from a nearby cloud. It wasn't just the enemy that could kill you. It was your own machine. Still they flew. Because every mission, every error, every blip of static taught the scientists something new. By late 1941, they were experimenting with new frequencies, shorter wavelengths, more precise detection. And somewhere in the secret halls of TRE, a word began to echo: microwave. The magnetron, a device so small it could fit in a hand, had been refined to generate radar signals powerful enough to pierce clouds and weather. It would soon give birth to a revolution not just in war but in the entire modern world. But for now it was a weapon. And the men who wielded it were learning how to kill by echo. The Beaufighter was evolving too. New engines gave it speed, better guns gave it reach. The crews began to form an unspoken bond, pilot and operator, two souls tied together in darkness. Some lasted only weeks. Others became legends. Among them was John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, one of the first RAF aces of the night. Cunningham was calm, methodical, unflinching. He credited his successes to carrots. At least that's what the propaganda said. Posters across Britain claimed carrots improved night vision, encouraging civilians to grow them during rationing. But the truth behind that myth was radar. Cunningham was guided by it. And the British government would rather Germans believe in vegetables than in invisible waves. Behind the humor was a deadly truth. Radar had become the most closely guarded secret of the war. Even mentioning it outside secured facilities was forbidden. Pilots were told never to speak of radio detection, only to refer to special equipment. Engineers disguised components as ordinary instruments. If a plane crashed in enemy territory, recovery teams raced to destroy the evidence. The invisible eye had to remain invisible. And yet the enemy was learning. Across the channel, German scientists were listening too, literally. They developed devices to detect British radar emissions, crude receivers that could hear the faint pulses from chain home towers. Soon they began to understand, the British could see them coming. But they still didn't know how the British could see them at night. By late 1941, German pilots began modifying their tactics. They flew lower, changed approach routes, cut engines to glide silently through the final miles. But the Beaufighters adapted too. Their radar didn't need moonlight or sound. It simply reached out and found them. Night after night, the dance continued. Radar beam meets metal wing. Echo meets gunfire. Flame meets silence. In Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was furious. His promise of total air supremacy was crumbling. The Blitz had failed to break Britain's spirit. And now, the once invincible Luftwaffe was being bled in the dark. He demanded answers. His scientists scrambled to respond. By 1942, Germany introduced its own airborne radar, the Liechtenstein B/C. Bulky, heavy, and awkward, it gave German night fighters a chance to defend against the RAF's growing bomber offensive. But irony hung heavy in the air. The technology they now copied was born from the desperation they had once inflicted. Meanwhile, Britain's night defenses were transforming. The AIMK-4 radar was being improved with new tuning systems, faster updates, and automatic range tracking. Controllers on the ground used massive plotting boards, tracking raids in real time, vectoring Beaufighters into intercept courses. The once blind defenders now fought with precision. The war in the dark had become a war of frequencies. Every innovation led to a countermeasure. Every signal became a weapon. Luftwaffe crews soon learned to fear silence as much as noise. They could feel the radar before they saw its result. An instinct, a prickling sense that something unseen had locked onto them. The first hint was often the tracer fire tearing through their wings. And yet, for the British crews, fear was never far away. The radar gave them vision but not safety. They were flying through storms, fog, and anti-aircraft fire, often without horizon or ground reference. Many crashed before ever seeing an enemy. Some vanished into the sea, their final echoes fading on the screen. Still they flew. Because every mission brought Britain one step closer to survival. The war was changing shape. What began as defense had become offense. And as 1942 dawned, the RAF was no longer just repelling attacks. It was striking back, deep into Germany itself. Now it was the Luftwaffe's turn to defend. And the ghosts of the night, the Beaufighters, would soon find themselves mirrored by new hunters in the dark. But back in those early days in the blacked-out fields of southern England, no one could see that far ahead. The only thing that mattered was the next blip on the screen, the next echo in the void. It was an invisible duel fought by faith and fear. Sometimes radar operators swore they heard whispers in the static, voices that weren't there. They called it ghost talk, random interference that sounded eerily human. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was something else. War does strange things to the mind. Especially when your only window to the world is a green flicker of light. Down below, British cities began to breathe again. The Blitz was fading. The Luftwaffe's nightly raids had slowed, their confidence shattered. For the first time in 2 years, Londoners could walk through the ruins under a sky that wasn't burning. But victory had a cost, and the men who won it would carry that cost forever. Some could never sleep again without the hum of engines in their ears. Others dreamed of falling through the dark endlessly. And the scientists who had made it all possible watched their creation with mixed pride and unease. They had built a machine to save lives, and discovered a way to kill with mathematics. As Britain celebrated survival, the men at TRE prepared for the next phase. The AIMK-4 radar had given them sight. Now they would give that sight new power, range, precision, and control. They were about to shrink the invisible eye again, to bring clarity to chaos, and to change the nature of war forever. By 1942, the war in the air had become something new, something colder, quieter, and far more calculated. No longer a battle of daylight raids and dogfights, but of signals and shadows. The night had become a chessboard of invisible moves. Each side played not with armies but with echoes. In Britain, the Beaufighter's radar, the AIMK-4, was nearing its limits. It could see targets up to 4 miles away but only under ideal conditions. The image on the cathode screen was crude, the range uncertain, and ground clutter often blinded the system over land. The operators were masters of instinct, but even instinct had boundaries. The scientists at TRE knew it too. If Britain wanted to stay ahead, radar had to evolve again, smaller, sharper, deadlier. That evolution began in a cramped lab where air buzzed with ozone and static. A handful of engineers, led by John Randall and Harry Boot, worked on an experimental vacuum tube no larger than a fist. Inside it, electrons spiraled through a magnetic field, generating microwave energy, wavelengths 1,000 times shorter than the old systems. They called it the cavity magnetron. When it worked, it changed everything. The magnetron allowed radar to operate at centimeter wavelengths, giving pinpoint accuracy and the ability to fit inside compact fighter aircraft. The ghosts on the screen became sharp, distinct echoes. Mountains vanished from interference. Targets stood out like silhouettes in fog. For the first time, the invisible world came into focus. The British military rushed to exploit it. A new generation of airborne radar, the AIMK-7 and MK-8, was born, sleeker, more precise, with rotating antennas that swept the sky like mechanical eyes. And the Beaufighter, that rugged twin-engine beast, would carry it into war. But radar alone wasn't enough. The men who flew with it needed to learn a new language, of frequencies, vectors, and pulse delays. Pilots and operators trained relentlessly, often flying mock battles over blacked-out countryside. They practiced until instinct took over, until they could navigate by nothing but a trace of light on glass. Every second mattered. Every mistake meant death. Night after night, the Beaufighters took off from hidden airfields, Tangmere, Coltishall, Wittering, their propellers cutting the mist like knives. Inside, the crews spoke little. The routine was ritual. Warm up engines. Check instruments. Calibrate radar. Then climb into the dark. At 15,000 feet, England disappeared below them. The world became a void of cold wind and distant static. The operator watched the screen. Contact 10 miles. The pilot nodded. Adjusted course. The blip grew stronger. 8 miles. Closing. Pause. 6 miles. 4. Then the faint outline of a bomber emerged from the dark, the ghost made flesh. The cannons roared. And the sky burned. Down below, German crews began to dread the blackness more than flak. The night that once protected them now betrayed them. They called it Die Hölle der Unsichtbaren, the hell of the unseen. Rumors spread through Luftwaffe bases in France and the Low Countries. There are English planes that see in the dark, they whispered. They fly without lights. They come from nowhere. Some pilots refused to fly without moonlight. Others carried talismans, tokens, anything to ward off the unseen death. But the truth was crueler than any myth. The British didn't see them. They sensed them, through the invisible heartbeat of radar pulses. Still, technology never belongs to one side for long. In early 1942, German engineers finally unveiled their answer, the Liechtenstein radar. It was crude and heavy, the antennas forming a spider-like array on the nose of the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and the Junkers Ju-88 night fighters. But it worked. For the first time, the Luftwaffe could defend against the RAF's growing bomber offensive. The Hunter now had its own eyes. And so the duel began anew. In the skies over the Ruhr, British bombers streamed toward industrial targets, guided by navigational aids like G and Oboe, systems that used timing and triangulation to guide them through darkness. But waiting in the shadows were German night fighters, their radars crackling, their screens glowing with the echoes of incoming raids. The war had become a mirror. Radar against radar. Signal against signal. At first, the Germans held the upper hand. Their new tactics, known as Himmelbett, or canopy bed, divided the night into radar-controlled sectors. Ground controllers tracked the bombers and vectored fighters toward them. The system worked too well. British losses soared. The invisible advantage was slipping. But the British too were listening. Every radar pulse leaves a trace. Every frequency can be found. Soon, British intelligence began to intercept the Liechtenstein signals. Scientists at TRE analyzed the patterns, the intervals, the wavelengths. They built countermeasures, small transmitters that emitted false echoes, creating phantom targets on German screens. The code name, Window. It was simple, almost absurd. Thin strips of aluminum foil dropped from bombers. Each one reflected radar waves, flooding enemy displays with chaos. In a single night, the Germans' invisible eyes went blind. 4 months, the British withheld the secret, afraid the enemy would copy it. But when the moment came, during the massive Hamburg raid of July 1943, they unleashed it. The sky over Germany filled with chaff. Liechtenstein radars screamed with false signals. German night fighters scrambled in confusion, chasing ghosts while real bombers struck their targets unopposed. For the men inside those bombers, the scene was unreal, metallic snow glittering in the moonlight, drifting down through the flames of burning cities. War had become science fiction. Back in England, the Beaufighter squadrons were transitioning to newer aircraft, the Mosquito. Faster, lighter, more elegant, but built on the same foundation, radar-guided vision in the night. The Beaufighter, though aging, remained the workhorse, its silhouette still haunting the dark over the channel. Pilots spoke of strange moments, of chasing enemy echoes that vanished mid-scan, of feeling pursued by their own reflections. The line between hunter and hunted blurred. Because when you stare into the dark long enough, the dark stares back. Some said radar changed men. That those who relied on it lost something human, replaced instinct with signal, sight with math. They trusted machines more than their own eyes. But others saw it differently. They believed radar was the purest form of faith, believing in what you cannot see, yet knowing it's there. In smoky briefing rooms, commanders traced routes across maps littered with pins. Scientists stood beside them, explaining pulse repetition frequencies and azimuth cones. Men who once fought with courage now fought with equations. And yet, courage remained. Each mission demanded it, climbing into the dark, trusting the flicker of light to guide you home. The radar operator's voice was the heartbeat of every night fighter. Calm, measured, never breaking. When the echo grew stronger, he'd whisper, "Steady. Closing." And when silence fell, they'd both know what it meant. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe's night raids over Britain had all but ended. Their bombers, once symbols of terror, were now prey. But in the east, over Germany, the RAF's bombers faced the same invisible enemy, the radar-guided night fighters of the Reich. The technology born to defend now served both sides. The duel had no front line. Only echoes moving through the night. And in this invisible war, one truth became clear: whoever saw first, lived. Yet beneath the triumphs and statistics lay a quieter story: the men themselves. The radar operators, the scientists, the mechanics. Many were barely out of their 20s. They lived in isolated huts, working through rain, blackout, and fear. They weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They were listeners, watchers, guardians of the unseen. They'd sit for hours beside the humming machines, eyes burning, waiting for a single flicker that could mean life or death. Sometimes they'd never know the outcome. They'd pass coordinates, watch the blip vanish, and wait for the next one. No faces, no glory, only echoes. When dawn came, the operators stepped outside into the mist, eyes blinking against real sunlight. They could still hear the hum, phantom tones that lingered long after the radar shut down. The war had entered their minds. It had tuned them to a frequency that would never fade. And in that strange twilight between science and fear, humanity took one of its greatest leaps, into the age of electronic warfare. The radar that once saved London was now saving bombers over Berlin. The weapon that once hunted in secret had become the soul of modern combat. And somewhere, in the quiet of a hangar before another mission, a Beaufighter pilot placed a hand on the cold metal of his machine, feeling its heartbeat, the vibration of engines that would carry him once more into the dark. He knew the risks. He knew he might never return. But as long as the radar screen glowed, he wasn't blind. And that, in war, was enough. By 1943, radar had changed everything. The way men fought, the way they feared, the way they thought about the night itself. What began as a desperate defense in the dark had evolved into a silent empire of pulses and echoes. Britain's cities no longer burned under the nightly thunder of the Blitz. Now it was the RAF's turn to strike, to take the war back across the Channel into the heart of the Reich. And with that reversal came a new kind of warfare, one fought not only with bullets or bombs, but with light no one could see. From airfields scattered across Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, black silhouettes of bombers rose into the mist, their propellers slicing through the fog like metronomes of fate. Inside, the airmen sat in the half-light of their instruments, green phosphor dials, the steady hum of vacuum tubes, the heartbeat of engines they trusted more than their own eyes. They no longer looked for the enemy with sight. They listened for him in static, traced him in lines of green on glass. They were flying by faith in the invisible. But below them the Germans had built their own web. The Kammhuber line, a chain of radar zones stretching from Denmark to France, each named with grim irony Himmelbett, canopy bed. In those beds, German night fighters waited. Ground radar guided them through the dark like hunters on a leash. When the British bombers crossed the line, a light would flash on a screen, a vector would be given, and somewhere in the blackness above a sleeping village the trap would spring. For the men in the bombers, death came without warning. A flash of cannon fire, a burst of flame, the aircraft tumbling like a dying comet through cloud. Entire crews vanished in silence. The sky, once their shield, had become a mirror turned against them. In the operations rooms of Bomber Command, the maps began to bleed red. Pins marked where squadrons never came back. And again the scientists were called. The same men who had built radar to see through the dark were now asked to make their planes invisible to it. At a small station in Malvern, behind blackout curtains and the hum of secret machines, British researchers began to fight light with lies. They had captured pieces of German radar, the Liechtenstein, and traced its frequency, its heartbeat. It was predictable, rhythmic, almost human in its regularity. And like any rhythm, it could be broken. Their answer was something absurdly simple: foil. Strips of thin aluminum, cut to precise lengths, tuned to the same wavelength as the German radar beam. Drop a handful and each piece would appear as a false echo. Drop thousands and the screens would bloom with ghosts. They called it window. The idea was terrifying and forbidden. If Germany learned the trick, she could blind Britain in return. For months, the project sat in silence, its fate sealed by fear. Until July 1943. Hamburg. The operation's code name was Gemara, a name chosen not for poetry but prophecy. That night, as the bombers crossed the North Sea, the navigators opened their hatches and released clouds of window. The air sparkled briefly as the foil caught the moonlight, then vanished into the dark. Below, in German control rooms, radar screens erupted in madness. Thousands of blips. Thousands of targets. A sky so crowded with lies that truth itself disappeared. Controllers shouted orders into radios. Fighters scrambled, turned, chased nothing. The Kammhuber line collapsed. And Hamburg burned for 7 days. The raid killed more than 40,000 people. Entire neighborhoods were erased in a storm of fire. But for the men in London, it was proof that the invisible war could be won, not by force but by deception. Yet the victory carried a shadow. For the first time, both sides realized that the machines they had created could no longer be trusted. Every pulse could be real or false. Every silence could be a trap. In Berlin, engineers tore apart their radar sets, searching for a flaw that wasn't there. Göring raged that the British must be using witchcraft. Pilots whispered about unsichtbare Augen, invisible eyes, that saw through cloud and smoke. Fear crept into the steel discipline of the Luftwaffe. And fear, once it takes root, spreads faster than fire. The British meanwhile moved faster. Beaufighters gave way to mosquitoes, sleek, wooden, impossibly fast. Built from plywood, almost invisible to radar, powered by the same cavity magnetron that once guided the Beaufighter's hunt. The mosquito didn't just fly. It stalked. It could climb unseen, strike and vanish into the black. To the Germans it was a ghost made of wood. To the British, it was proof that innovation was worth every sleepless night. By late 1943 the air war over Europe had become a duel between ghosts. The Germans developed Naxos to detect the emissions from British radar. The British countered with Serrate, which could home in on the German Liechtenstein. Then came Boozer, Jostle, Monica, names that sounded harmless but carried the weight of hundreds of deaths. Each side hunted not planes but frequencies. Each silence meant someone, somewhere, was listening. The air crackled with invisible fire. Pilots heard static that wasn't there, voices that belonged to no one. Some began to believe the radar itself was haunted, that the dead spoke through the noise. But it wasn't ghosts. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare, one fought by electrons and fear. And behind every breakthrough were men slowly unraveling. Radar operators, boys barely 20, sat for hours staring at green light until the afterimage burned into their eyes. They began to see blips where there were none, to hear echoes long after the machines were silent. The war was carving itself into their minds, one pulse at a time. Still the system worked. The Beaufighter and Mosquito squadrons rose night after night, and German bombers fell faster than they could be built. The Luftwaffe's proud night-fighting arm, once the hunter, was now prey. But victory in this war of shadows never felt clean. When the pilots landed at dawn, they didn't cheer. They sat in silence, staring through the cockpit glass as the sun rose over the airfield, too tired to feel triumph. In the debriefing rooms, the reports came in clipped, hollow voices. Contact. Engagement. Loss of signal. War had been reduced to data. Yet somewhere beneath that mechanical calm, humanity still flickered. One radar operator wrote in his log after his final mission, "When I turned off the set, the room went black and I realized how quiet the world really was. The war had become a hum and now it was gone. For a moment I could hear the sea again." By the end of 1943, Britain's invisible empire stretched from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. The radar that began as a fragile dream on a windy coast had become the nervous system of an entire war. It saw what men could not, struck before the enemy could react, and gave the night back to those who once feared it. But in doing so, it also took something, the boundary between man and machine, between instinct and calculation. And somewhere above the Manche, as the echoes faded into static, a question remained. When man teaches the machine to feel his fear, who is really watching whom? By early 1944, the skies above Europe had changed forever. What once belonged to darkness and chance was now ruled by mathematics, frequency, and fear. The RAF no longer flew blind, and the Luftwaffe no longer trusted their eyes. The night had become a battlefield of invisible intelligence, a war fought not in sight but in sound and silence. Across Britain, the hum of radar never stopped. In coastal towers, on ships, in the bellies of aircraft, the pulse of the magnetron beat like a second heart for the Empire. And every beat carried a secret, that the human ear and eye were no longer enough. The machines had become extensions of the men who built them, precise, tireless, unfeeling. But for those who lived within that glow of green light, the war had turned inward. They began to ask themselves what victory really meant when it came not from courage but from control. On the German side, the fear had curdled into superstition. Pilots whispered that the British had learned to fly without light, to see through cloud and soul alike. They said the enemy's planes came from nowhere, silent, patient, merciless. For Luftwaffe crews, every shadow was a trap, every spark in the sky an omen. In mess halls they joked darkly that radar had replaced God. At least God, they said, gave warning. Radar did not. Many night fighter crews refused to take off without crossing themselves, even those who had long abandoned faith. Some wrote letters home they knew would never be sent. A few turned their radios off mid-flight, preferring to die blind than hear that final pulse, the heartbeat of something hunting them. One German pilot, after surviving an attack by a mosquito he never saw, wrote in his log, "It was not a man who shot me down. It was an idea." He was right. In Britain's laboratories, that idea had already grown beyond radar. Scientists were experimenting with proximity fuses, beam navigation, ground-controlled interception networks. Information was becoming weaponized, compressed, transmitted, analyzed faster than thought. The future was being written in cathode light. The operators didn't know it, but they were the first generation of the modern world, the age where data would kill as efficiently as any bullet. The war had taught them that knowledge itself could be destructive. Every echo was a choice, to look or to turn away. Some never stopped hearing it. Even years after the war, Veterans said that rain on rooftops or the hum of distant engines brought back the rhythm of radar. A heartbeat of ghosts. The Beaufighter, once the hunter of the night, was nearing its end. Lighter, faster aircraft had taken its place. The Mosquito, the de Havilland Hornet, and soon the jet-powered Meteor. But the Beaufighter's shadow lingered. It had been the bridge between two worlds, one of muscle and propeller and one of machine and frequency. It was born from fear and driven by desperation, yet it changed the course of history. For the first time, man had extended his senses beyond himself, into something electrical, something that would outlive him. Every pilot who touched its controls became part of that transition, from instinct to instrumentation, from war fought by courage to war fought by computation. And though few of them said it aloud, many felt the same unease, that they were no longer merely flying the machine, perhaps the machine was flying them. By the spring of 1944, the tide of war had turned. The Allies controlled the night. German bombers no longer reached English soil. The Beaufighters and Mosquitoes flew over Normandy, guarding the invasion fleet, hunting what was left of the Luftwaffe in the darkness. The radar screens flickered constantly now, not from enemies but from the sheer volume of life in the sky. The hum of victory was everywhere. Yet amid that triumph, the veterans of the radar war felt something hollow. They had seen too much of what light could do when weaponized. They had watched technology erase the need for courage and with it, part of their own humanity. In quiet moments they would remember the early days, 1936, the smell of wet grass at Bawdsey, the laughter of young engineers testing antennas on the beach, believing they were building something to save lives. They were. But they were also building something that would change mankind's relationship with truth itself. Because radar did more than reveal what was hidden. It taught man that nothing could remain hidden forever. After the war, the airfields fell silent. The Beaufighters were scrapped, their metal repurposed for peace. The radar towers on the coast rusted under rain. But the hum never truly died. It moved underground, into research centers, into the Cold War, into the endless eyes of satellites orbiting the Earth. The men who once stared into radar screens now looked up at television sets, early computers, oscilloscopes, the same glow, a different purpose. The line between warfare and innovation had vanished. And somewhere, in that blur between fear and progress, a new kind of world was born. One where power was measured not by armies but by who could see first. In 1943, the German pilots called the Beaufighter the Whispering Death. They feared it because it struck without light, without sound, without mercy. But in truth, the Beaufighter was only the messenger. The real whisper was the one that began in 1936, on that windy British coast, when a handful of scientists first caught the echo of their own signal returning from the sky. That whisper became a hum. The hum became a network. The network became the future. If you listen closely on certain nights, when the wind is calm and the horizon flickers with lightning, you might still hear it, the faint rhythm of a pulse bouncing through air, searching for something to reflect from. A signal without a target. A question waiting for an answer. The war is long over, but the echoes remain. Because radar did not just win a battle. It changed what it meant to be blind. And it taught mankind that in the end, the most terrifying thing about the dark is realizing it was never truly empty. If you've been drawn into this story of the war fought in silence, the men, the machines, and the invisible battles that shaped the modern world, stay with us. There are countless forgotten echoes left to uncover. Subscribe and join us as we bring light to the wars that were never seen, only felt.